welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, I want you to do something for me for a second. Just picture this.
Okay.
Imagine you are the CEO. Not just any CEO. You're the head of the oldest, largest, and, well, most powerful multinational corporation on the planet.
Right, a legacy brand.
The ultimate legacy brand. I mean, you have branches in every single village. Your logo is universally recognized. And for 1,000 years, you haven't just dominated the market. You were the market. There was no one else.
A total, complete monopoly, not just on the product, but on the entire worldview surrounding it.
Exactly. And then, almost overnight, it feels like half your market share just evaporates. A scrappy startup, a competitor, launches a new product.
Yeah.
And it's cheaper, it's more accessible, and its core marketing message is that your product is defective.
Fundamentally flawed.
Corrupt. Broken. And they're telling everyone.
And the worst part of it all, the really terrible part, they're not entirely wrong, are they?
Not at all. That's the sting. And suddenly your customers are rioting. They're literally tearing your logos down off the buildings. Your middle managers are quitting in droves, joining the competition. The board of directors is in an absolute panic.
The whole thing is on fire.
The unity you took for granted for centuries, it's gone. It's shattered. So the question we're tackling today is, what do you do? I mean, what can you do? Do you just fold? Do you declare bankruptcy?
Do you just admit defeat?
Or do you pull off the single greatest corporate turnaround in the history of the world?
It really is the ultimate case study in crisis management. But, even calling it corporate sort of cheapens it. We're not talking about widgets or software here.
No.
We're talking about the soul of Europe.
We are talking about the Catholic Church in the 16th century. The Reformation, the moment the entire Western world just cracked in half. We've got a really fascinating stack of documents today, articles, some historical analysis, a few primary source excerpts, and they're all focused on one specific thing: the response.
The Counter-Reformation. And it's a term that's often framed as just a counterattack, a purely defensive war. But the material we have here today, it suggests something much, much more nuanced.
How so?
Well, it wasn't just about fighting the Protestants. It was about grappling with a deep existential question. Who are we now?
Who are we now that our authority has been questioned? And that phrase, authority questioned, it just keeps popping up in all the research, doesn't it? It feels like the hook for this whole story.
It is, because when your authority is absolute, you never have to explain yourself. You just are.
Yeah.
But the moment it's questioned, well, suddenly you need to have some very good answers.
And the stakes, we have to be clear. They couldn't possibly be higher. This isn't a disagreement over tax policy or borders.
No, this is about the eternal soul. It's about salvation. From their perspective, if the church is wrong, then millions of people for centuries have been led down the path to damnation.
And if the church is right,
then this whole rebellion is a spiritual catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. So, yeah, no pressure.
No pressure at all. So the floor is completely dropped out. The roadmap for today's deep dive is pretty intense. We're going to look at how this massive ancient institution managed to stop the bleeding. First, we'll talk about what they call the internal audit, which sounds a bit dry, but it's actually filled with scandal and purges and a whole lot of drama.
It's the cleaning house phase.
Exactly. Then we're going to go to the Council of Trent. I've always thought of it as this, incredibly boring theological meeting, but reading these notes, it turns out it was basically a decades-long war room.
It absolutely was. It was the strategic hub for the entire century. Everything flows from Trent.
From there, we'll get into the special forces they deployed, the Jesuits, and then finally, my favorite part, we're going to talk about the weaponization of art.
A brilliant, brilliant strategy.
How they used beauty, literally beauty, to fight a theological war. But the core theme, the thing I really want us to keep coming back to, is this idea from one of our source texts that says, reform did not come from the outside alone. It began within.
And that's the whole ballgame right there.
It wasn't just about fighting the enemy at the gates. It was about fixing the house from the inside out. That tension. Internal renewal versus external defense.
Which is, it's the hardest thing for any person or any institution to do, isn't it? When you're under attack, your gut instinct is to bunker down, shoot back, and deny everything.
Right. Blame everyone else.
But to actually stop mid-battle, look in the mirror and say, okay, we have a problem while the enemy is literally pounding at the door. That takes incredible nerve.
It really does. So let's get into it. Section 1, the internal audit, the house cleaning. Our source material uses this very direct phrase, corruption was confronted. Now, we need to be really clear here. When we say corruption in the 16th century church, we aren't talking about, someone stealing a few pens from the supply closet.
Oh, no, not even close. We're talking about systemic, deep-rooted, and in some cases, openly celebrated rot. You have to understand the landscape. The most famous example, of course, is the sale of indulgences.
The spark that lit the whole fire with Martin Luther.
It was the spark. The idea that you could essentially pay money to the church to get time off in purgatory for yourself or a loved one, it looked for all the world like you were buying your way into heaven.
And was that actually the doctrine? Or was it just bad salesmanship?
That's the thing. It was a bit of both. The official theology was more nuanced, but on the ground, the salesmen, like a guy named Johann Tetzel in Germany, were basically running campaigns like, as soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. It was a fundraising scheme that had spun completely out of control.
But the source material suggests it went way deeper than just indulgences.
Much deeper. You had something called simony.
Simony, what's that?
Buying and selling church offices. If you were a rich, noble family, let's say you're the Borgias or the Medicis in Italy, and you wanted your 17-year-old son to be a bishop or even a cardinal.
You didn't send him to seminary and hope he was pious.
You didn't even care if he was pious. You just wrote a very large check to the right people in Rome. You bought the position, which means you had a huge chunk of the church's leadership who were not spiritual leaders. They were political appointees, businessmen, landlords.
So you have leaders who don't care about the mission. They might not even believe in the mission.
They often didn't even know the mission. You had bishops who held multiple dioceses, that's called pluralism, and they'd never set foot in any of them. This is called absenteeism. They were just collecting the tax revenue from all these church lands and living in absolute luxury in Rome or Florence.
Meanwhile, the actual people in the pews are being led by who?
By a local parish priest who was probably poor, likely uneducated, and maybe couldn't even read the Latin Bible he was supposed to be preaching from. That's the house in disorder that the texts mention. It was a top-heavy, corrupt, and often incompetent administration.
So when the source says corruption was confronted, it's not a small thing. It's the church, finally, after decades of criticism, admitting, okay, Luther has a point.
He has a point. Maybe not on all the fine points of theology, they would never concede that, but on the behavior, on the outrageous abuses. Yes, he was right. And that had to be an incredibly painful, humiliating admission.
It's like a company having to issue a massive product recall and admitting their flagship product is dangerous.
It is. Imagine having to admit that the people who claim to hold the keys to the kingdom of heaven are actually just selling them for cash. But they did it. And the source notes that discipline was restored.
I love that word, restored. It implies it was there once, it completely vanished, and they had to physically drag it back.
That's a great way to put it. It means the party was over. The late Renaissance papacy was, well, it was a wild time. The Counter-Reformation was a moment of immense tightening of the belt. They had to actually enforce rules that had been on the books but ignored for a century or more.
Like what? What actually changed on the ground?
Well, for one, bishops were forced to actually live in their diocese. That was a huge one. They had to be pastors to their flock, not just absentee landlords.
Seems pretty basic.
You would think. And priests had to be educated. This is the birth of the modern seminary system. Before this, training was all over the place. Now, they mandated that every diocese had to have a school for training priests in theology and scripture.
So the internal audit was basically a purge of the casual, corrupt, aristocratic lifestyle that had completely taken over the institution's leadership.
And that's such a crucial insight for anyone listening. You cannot possibly win an external battle if your internal discipline is gone. If your house is a complete mess. If the church had tried to fight the intellectual arguments of Protestantism without first fixing its own glaring moral failures, they would have been laughed out of the room.
They had no credibility.
None. They had to regain the moral high ground before they could do anything else.
But the cleanup wasn't just about behavior, was it? It was also about the message itself. The text says, doctrine was clarified.
This is the second and arguably more important half of the audit. You fix the behavior, yes. But then you have to fix the confusion.
Why was clarification so important here? I mean, this is an institution that had been around for 1,500 years. Didn't they know what they believed?
You'd be surprised, honestly. Before the Reformation, there was a lot of what you might call Theological fuzziness. There were many different schools of thought within Catholicism. You had Thomists, Scotists, Augustinians, all arguing about the fine points. There were different local traditions, different customs. It wasn't all written down in a single, rigid, universal handbook.
It was wiggle room.
A lot of wiggle room.
Yeah.
And that was fine when you were the only game in town. But then Martin Luther shows up, and he isn't fuzzy. He is incredibly precise. He prints pamphlets with crystal clear slogans. Sola fide by faith alone. Sola scriptura by scripture alone.
So he has these laser-focused arguments, and the church couldn't just respond by saying, well, it's complicated.
Exactly. Luther's precision was his weapon. The church's initial response was a bit flabby, a bit, well, some theologians say this, others say that. They realized very quickly that ambiguity is lethal when your authority is being questioned. If you can't define your own position clearly, you can't possibly defend it.
So the clarification was a defense mechanism. They were hardening the shell.
It was a survival mechanism. They had to go through every single topic. The Protestants attacked justification, the sacraments, the role of the priesthood, purgatory, and define the Catholic position with absolute legalistic precision. No more gray areas, no more wiggle room.
So step 1, stop the corruption, restore discipline. Step 2, figure out exactly what we stand for and write it down.
Which leads us perfectly to the place where all of this happened, the strategic hub, the Council of Trent.
The Council of Trent.
The main event.
Now, in history class, this is usually the part where people's eyes glaze over. The council met, they issued some decrees, the end. But reading through these notes, this sounds less like a board meeting and more like a hostage negotiation that went on for 18 years.
Intermittently, yes, from 1545 to 1563. And it wasn't continuous. There were huge breaks. It happened in 3 different sessions spanning across the reigns of 5 different popes. And you have to picture the scene. Trent wasn't a major capital like Rome. It's a smaller city in the mountains of northern Italy.
Hi there.
It was a compromise. The Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, wanted the council in Germany on his home turf to appease the Protestants. The Pope wanted it in Italy under his control. Trent was technically in the empire, but culturally Italian. It was sort of neutral ground.
So they're all huddled in the mountains, effectively trying to save the world.
Huddled in cathedrals, arguing for weeks, months, years over a single word in a single sentence of a decree. It was a geopolitical nightmare. You have the emperor's faction wanting one thing, the pope's faction wanting another. The French bishops are conspiring against the Spanish bishops. It was a mess.
But the goal, the one thing that united them, according to our text, was to answer the Reformation and, more importantly, to redefine Catholic identity. That word redefine just keeps sticking with me.
It should. It is the absolute key to this entire episode. Think about it this way. Before the Council of Trent, you could be a Catholic who, sort of leaned towards some of Luther's ideas on grace. You could think, hey, maybe faith really is more important than works. There was a spectrum of acceptable belief.
And after Trent?
Absolutely not. The spectrum vanished. They drew a hard line in the sand.
They didn't just draw a line. It sounds like they built a wall.
Wow.
The source lists 3 major outcomes. Errors were rejected, traditions reaffirmed, and scripture and teaching aligned. Let's break those down because this feels like where the rubber really meets the road.
It is. This is the new blueprint.
Okay, errors rejected. This is the no part of the strategy, right? This is the finger wagging.
It's the most aggressive part. The council issued hundreds of these things called canons. They're short, legalistic statements of doctrine. And almost all of them end with the same terrifying phrase, anathema sit.
Which means?
Let him be accursed. Or, more bluntly, let him be condemned to hell.
Wow. That's intense.
It is. So you get canons like, if anyone says that the sinner is justified by faith alone, let him be anathema. If anyone says that there are more or less than 7 sacraments, let him be anathema. They weren't trying to find common ground with the Protestants. They were systematically identifying every single Protestant belief and officially, dogmatically, rejecting it in the strongest possible terms.
That's a really interesting strategy. In modern crisis management, the advice is usually to de-escalate. Apologize, find a middle ground, compromise.
Right. Show you're listening.
But the church looked at the Reformation and said, no,
yeah,
we will not compromise.
Yeah.
You are wrong, we are right, and here is the door.
It was a huge gamble. They essentially decided that a smaller, more disciplined, more unified church was better than a large, messy, fractured one. They chose clarity over inclusion. They purged the ambiguity.
So that's the no. What about the second part? Traditions reaffirmed.
This is the yes part. This is where they doubled down. The Protestants attacked the veneration of saints and relics. They attacked the doctrine of purgatory. They attacked the authority of the Pope, the seven sacraments, the use of Latin.
So Trent decided to, hide those things, downplay them.
The exact opposite. They didn't just keep them. They polished them, elevated them, and made them central pillars of the faith. They essentially said, not only are we keeping all of these traditions you hate, but we're now officially declaring them to be essential for salvation.
So instead of being embarrassed by the things people were criticizing, they shined a giant spotlight on them. Oh, you don't like praying to Mary? Well, guess what? We're going to build 10,000 more churches dedicated to her.
Precisely. It's a fascinating move in brand identity. If the competition says your product is too complex and old-fashioned, you don't simplify it, you rebrand the complexity as richness and the age as tradition and depth. They leaned into the mystery, into the very things that the Protestants called superstition.
It's a posture of pure confidence, even if they were panicking behind the scenes.
It is. And then there's the third point, which ties it all together. Scripture and teaching align.
The cleanup job.
The cleanup and the justification. One of the most powerful critiques from the Protestants was that Catholic teaching over the centuries had drifted away from the Bible, that traditions had been invented that had nice scriptural basis.
Right. Show me where it says purgatory in the Bible.
Exactly that question. So the council spent years, literally years, going through every single doctrine and tradition to ensure that their decrees could be backed up by Scripture, or at the very least, by their authoritative interpretation of Scripture and the writings of the early church fathers. They wanted to close that gap, real or perceived, between the text and the pulpit.
So when it's all said and done, Trent produces this fortress of belief. It feels like this is the moment the redefined identity is locked in.
It is.
Before Trent, being Catholic was just the default setting of being a European. It was the air you breathed. After Trent, being Catholic was a conscious choice. It was a specific set of beliefs that were now clearly and aggressively distinct from the guy down the street who was now a Lutheran or a Calvinist.
It almost militarized the identity. You were now part of a specific camp in a continent-wide conflict. And once you have a camp, once you have a clear manifesto, which is really what the decrees of Trent were, you need soldiers. You need people to go out and fight for it.
And that transitions us perfectly to the next phase, the implementation.
Yeah.
You've got the plan, now you need the people. Section 3, the new soldiers.
The new orders, and the source material rightly highlights the most important one.
The Jesuits.
The Society of Jesus.
The text calls them trained minds and missionaries, but then it uses this incredibly stark phrase, education became a weapon of faith. A weapon. That is not a soft, gentle word.
No, it's an aggressive word for an aggressive new reality. And to understand the Jesuits, you have to remember who founded them. A man named Ignatius of Loyola.
And he wasn't a priest or a scholar originally. He was a soldier, right?
A knight?
Exactly.
Yeah.
A Basque nobleman, a courtier, a soldier. His life was about chivalry and glory.
Yeah.
Then during a battle, his leg is shattered by a cannonball. A horrific injury.
So his military career is over.
Over. And while he's recovering, a long and painful recovery, he has nothing to read but a couple of books on the life of Christ and the saints. And he has a profound spiritual awakening. He decides to turn all of that military discipline, all that desire for glory, towards a new target.
Towards God.
Towards the service of the Pope. So he forms a new religious order, but he structures it like an army. There's a strict hierarchy. There's a general of the order. There's a focus on absolute obedience. And he adds a special fourth vow that other orders don't have.
Which is?
A vow of absolute direct obedience to the Pope to go wherever he sends them for the salvation of souls. So these are not your average parish priests making jam and tending the rose garden.
No. They are, in a very real sense, the Pope's shock troops. But their weapon wasn't the sword anymore. It was the mind. It was the brain.
So why education? Why was that the weapon of choice? Why not just rely on the Inquisition to root out heretics?
Well, let's be clear. The Inquisition was certainly a tool that was used, especially in Spain and Italy. But the Jesuits and the smarter leaders in Rome realized that the Reformation was fundamentally an intellectual rebellion. Martin Luther was a university professor, a brilliant doctor of theology. John Calvin was a genius, a lawyer, a scholar of the highest order.
You couldn't defeat them with ignorance or superstition?
You couldn't. You had to outthink them. You had to out-argue them. You had to be smarter, better read, and better trained than they were.
So they built schools.
They built the best schools in Europe, period. If you were a nobleman or a wealthy merchant in the 17th century and you wanted your son to get the absolute best classical education, to learn Greek, Latin, astronomy, philosophy, rhetoric, logic, you sent him to a Jesuit college.
Even if you were a Protestant?
Sometimes, yes. They were that good. Their curriculum was rigorous, their teachers were brilliant, and their strategy was simple.
If we control the education of the next generation of elites, we control the future of Europe.
That's it, exactly. And on a more immediate level, if we can go into any town square and publicly debate the best Protestant preacher and win, we win back the hearts and minds of the people. Imagine the scene. A Protestant preacher is there, quoting the Bible chapter and verse, dismantling the arguments of the local Catholic priest, who, as we said, is probably not very well educated. The crowd is swaying.
And then a Jesuit walks in.
He knows the Bible better than the Protestant. He knows it in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. He knows all the church fathers. He knows formal logic. And he proceeds to systematically dismantle the Protestant's argument, piece by piece, with intellectual force. The crowd sees this display of intellectual dominance. That was the weapon.
It connects right back to that clarified doctrine from the Council of Trent. Trent wrote the instruction manual, but the Jesuits were the field agents who memorized it and took it out into the world.
They were the master technicians of that new clarified doctrine. And they didn't just take it to Germany and France. The source text makes a crucial point. Missions crossed oceans.
This is the global ambition. I think this part is so often overlooked. We get bogged down in the European story, Germany, France, England.
But at the very same moment, the church was losing millions of souls in Northern Europe. The Jesuits and other new orders, like the Franciscans, were gaining millions of new converts in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia. A guy like Francis Xavier, one of Ignatius's original companions, traveled thousands upon thousands of miles to India, to Japan.
It's like a corporate diversification strategy. Okay, we're losing market share in our legacy territory, so let's open up massive new markets in the New World and the Far East.
It absolutely functions that way. It creates this powerful sense of momentum. Even if things looked grim in Berlin or Geneva, the Pope could look at the reports coming in from Mexico City or Goa or the Philippines and see massive expansion. It kept the morale of the entire institution up. It proved that the church was still Catholic with a small, meaning universal.
They didn't just bunker down in Rome, they went on the offensive globally.
They did. So we have the audit, which is fixing the rot. We have Trent, which is writing the new rules. And we have the Jesuits, who are the soldiers enforcing those rules. But there's one more piece to this puzzle. And honestly, this is the one that just blows my mind because it feels so incredibly modern. It feels like branding, feels like marketing. The visual strategy.
The source material has this beautiful line, "Art spoke where words could not."
And to get this, you have to think about the Protestant aesthetic. Have you ever been inside an old traditional Calvinist church?
Yeah, it's spare. White walls, clear glass windows, a big pulpit is the main focus. Maybe a simple wooden cross, but definitely no Jesus on it. It's very minimal.
It's stripped down, austere. The focus is entirely on the Word, the Bible, the sermon. It is a purely intellectual auditory experience. The reformers, many of them, were iconoclasts. They smashed the statues, they whitewashed the beautiful medieval frescoes. They called it idolatry, a distraction from true faith.
So the Catholic Church could have responded to that critique by saying, okay, you're right, we'll tone it down too, we'll be more humble, more simple.
But they did the exact opposite. They looked at the Protestants' minimalism and decided to turn the volume up to 11. This is the birth of the Baroque style.
The Baroque, yeah, just the word itself sounds heavy and ornate.
It is heavy, it's dramatic, it's emotional, it's a feast for the senses. The church seemed to realize that while the Protestants might be able to win a debate over Greek verb tenses in a university hall,
they couldn't compete with the raw, overwhelming power of beauty.
Exactly. And this brings us to that other line from the source. Cathedrals preached without sermons.
How does a building preach?
We'll walk into a great Baroque church in Rome, the Gesù, which is the mother church of the Jesuits, or St. Peter's Basilica. What happens to you physically, emotionally, when you walk in?
You feel small, insignificant, but also sort of lifted up. There's gold everywhere. The ceilings are painted in these incredible illusions, that make it look like the roof is gone and the heavens are literally opening up right above you.
Yeah.
The statues of the saints aren't just standing there. They look like they're moving, flying, weeping.
That is all calculated, every single bit of it. It's an architectural and artistic program designed to overwhelm the senses. It's designed to create a feeling of awe and wonder. If you are an illiterate peasant in, say, 1580, and you walk from the mud and filth of the street into this golden, glowing, heavenly cavern filled with saints and angels and music, you don't need to read a complex theological treatise to know that something powerful and divine is happening here. You feel it in your gut.
It's the user experience. The Protestants had a text-based interface. It was clean, efficient, but required you to be able to read. The Catholics built a fully immersive 3D virtual reality experience.
That is a fantastic analogy, yes. The Protestants demanded literacy and intellectual engagement. The Catholics appealed to the full range of human experience. They appealed to emotion, to the senses, to our love of spectacle.
And the source says, beauty taught doctrine. It wasn't just for show. How does a beautiful painting or a statue teach?
Look at the subjects they chose. After Trent, you see an explosion of art depicting the very things the Protestants rejected. You see countless paintings of the Virgin Mary, the Assumption, the coronation of the Virgin. You see dramatic depictions of the martyrdom of saints. You see art that emphasizes the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist.
So every painting is an argument.
Every painting is a sermon in color and form. Think of a famous statue like Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa. It's a statue of a female saint having a mystical divine experience. And it's incredibly physical, it's passionate, it's almost sensuous. What does that teach the viewer? It teaches that the divine isn't just an abstract, distant concept. It's a physical reality. It's something you can feel in your body. It reinforces the whole idea of the sacraments, the belief that God is present here and now in the physical world, in the bread and wine.
Which is precisely what so many Protestants were denying.
Exactly right. The Protestants said God is transcendent, he is in heaven, and he speaks only through the word. The Catholics used art to shout back, no, God is immanent. He is here in the bread, in the wine, in the lives of the saints, in this very church.
So the art wasn't just decoration on the wall. It was a weapon, just like the Jesuit education was a weapon.
It was a polemic. Every glorious altarpiece celebrating the Eucharist was a direct take that to the Reformers. Every swirling statue of a suffering saint was a reaffirmation of Catholic tradition and a rejection of Protestant austerity.
It really is a total encirclement strategy. If the highly trained Jesuits don't convince you with their airtight logic, the breathtaking architecture will convince you with its grandeur and emotion.
It makes the Catholic identity, that thing they redefined at Trent, something tangible, something you can see and hear and smell and touch. It's not just an idea you read in a book.
So we've looked at the individual pieces of the strategy, the audit, Trent, the Jesuits, the art, but we need to put it all together now. The source material concludes with this really powerful idea that we touched on at the beginning. The Counter-Reformation was not resistance alone. It was renewal.
And we really need to unpack that distinction. Resistance versus renewal. Because they sound similar.
Yeah.
They're worlds apart.
Resistance seems, easier to understand. It's fighting back. It's pushing against an opposing force.
Resistance is building a wall. It's purely defensive. It's trying to keep things exactly as they were before the crisis. If the church had only resisted, they would have just focused on the Inquisition, hunting heretics, and banning Protestant books, which, by the way, they did do. But if that's all they had done, it wouldn't have saved them.
Because the internal rot, the corruption we talked about at the start, would still be there. The house would still be a mess.
Exactly. The foundation would still be crumbling. Renewal is different. Renewal is accepting that the old way is broken, maybe even dead, and that you have to build a new, stronger version of yourself out of the wreckage.
A renewal from within.
The church reformed itself while defending its beliefs. That's the key sentence from the analysis. That is multitasking on a civilizational level. They didn't change their core doctrines. In fact, they hardened them, as we said, but they radically changed how they lived and governed and expressed those beliefs. They cleaned up the corruption. They educated their clergy. They revitalized the liturgy with this incredible outpouring of art and music.
So, to put it simply, resistance is just saying, don't let them in. Renewal is saying, let's become something so much better that we don't even need to worry about them.
Or perhaps, let's become so strong, so clearly defined, and so vibrant in our own identity that we can endure the storm and even thrive in it. And the proof is in the pudding, as they say. The source concludes, the result reshaped Catholicism for centuries to come.
Centuries? I mean, that's not an exaggeration, is it? The fundamental structure of the Catholic Church as we know it today, the seminary system for priests, the catechism, the strong focus on the authority of the Pope, the influence of orders like the Jesuits, it all comes directly from this moment.
The modern Catholic Church was forged in the fires of the Reformation and born at the Council of Trent. Before that, it was the medieval church, a different creature. This was the great pivot point. They managed to turn a moment of broken unity, an existential crisis, into a newly defined and energized identity that was strong enough to survive the Enlightenment, the Age of Revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, and all the challenges of the modern world.
It's just amazing to think that by confronting their own corruption, that first most painful step, they actually set themselves up for another 500 years of global relevance.
They turned a near-death experience into a genuine rebirth.
So let's bring this all back home for the listener. We always try to answer the so what question. Why should someone who's, driving to work or washing the dishes care about 16th century popes and councils?
Because the pattern is universal. I mean, every organization, every movement, every company, and frankly, every individual will eventually face a moment where their authority is questioned.
A moment of fracture, a personal reformation.
Absolutely. Maybe you get laid off from a job you thought was secure. Maybe your entire industry gets disrupted overnight by new technology like AI. Maybe you personally face a crisis of identity where you question everything you thought you stood for.
And the natural instinct, the first instinct, is to resist. It's to get defensive, to blame the Protestants, the competitors, the critics, the changing world.
But the great lesson of the Counter-Reformation is that the only way to survive a true existential crisis is through renewal. You have to be brave enough to do the internal audit. You have to confront your own corruption, your bad habits, your inefficiencies, the comfortable lies you've been telling yourself.
And then you have to clarify doctrine. You have to figure out who you really are now. What do you actually stand for? Because if you're fuzzy about your core identity in a moment of crisis, you're dead.
And then, once you're clear, you don't just hide. You project that new, clarified identity with confidence. You use your own version of the Jesuits, your education, your skills, your arguments, and you use your own version of Baroque art, your brand, your story, your emotional appeal. You communicate your value in every way you can.
True stability comes from the willingness to reform yourself, even while you are under fire. That is such a hard lesson. It's so much easier to just point fingers and shoot back.
It is. But shooting back only buys you time. Renewal buys you a future.
And the text leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to mull over. If the church had only resisted, if it had only run the Inquisition and not done the hard work of renewal at Trent, would it have survived?
Historians debate it, of course, but my gut says no. I doubt it. It would have become a regional Italian sect, a relic, a museum piece. Instead, it remained a dynamic global force.
A global force that learned how to preach without sermons and fight a war with beauty. I'm honestly never going to look at a Baroque church the same way again. I'm just going to see a strategic document written in marble and gold.
A weapon of faith.
Exactly. Well, that has been our deep dive for today. From the crisis of a broken unity to the strategic brilliance of the Council of Trent, it has been quite a journey. Thanks for sticking with us.
It's always a pleasure.
We'll see you in the next one. Keep questioning.